Hello and welcome to our next video from Billingsgate Roman House and Baths. We're welcoming back a speaker from before who was very, very popular. But let me introduce myself. I'm Kim Biddulph. I'm here with my colleague Andrew Lane.
Hello.
And welcome back Dr Jane Sidell, who is the Inspector of Ancient Monuments, let's get it right, for Historic England for London. Hi Jane.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Thank you for coming back to talk to us. Your tour of the London Wall was really, really popular. I see. Did you do that again for someone else a little bit later, I think?
Yes, I did that for Lammas. Normally, the London and Middlesex Archaeological Society does little evening walks and tours in the summer. So we decided to go online this year because of obviously the COVID restrictions, and we trialled a walking tour around London Wall, which I admit was a fair gallop, but it worked very well, and actually the members were pleased. So we're going to be doing some more tours for Lammas like that.
That's great, and it certainly was very, very popular for us as well. I think a lot of people watched that, and now you can actually get it into London if you want to brave public transport, or if you live close and you walk or cycle, and get in to actually follow that tour around the bits of London Wall that you can see just out in the street, which is amazing, really, when you think about it. But today, Jane is going to talk to us about conservation at Billingsgate Roman House and Baths, and what has to be done to keep the site safe and to keep it healthy, and make sure that it doesn't start to crack and maybe flood and things like that. So there's that's what you're going to be talking to us about today. Is that right, Jane?
That's correct. Yep.
Brilliant. Right. Well, over to you.
Okay, this is just to give an idea of Roman London. It was relatively small, and this shows the outline of the London Wall and some of the sites. The Billingsgate Bathhouse is down in the southeast corner. Can you see my cursor there waggling around?
Yeah, we can see that.
That's where the bathhouse is, so it's relatively close to the Tower of London, and it was really close to the River Thames, and that's relevant. The River Thames has been reclaimed a bit since the Roman period, but it would have been much nearer to the bathhouse in the Roman period. Now, normally we would be happily inviting people to come to the bathhouse for open house. And it's one of the highlights of the year, really, because we get to talk to several thousand people and show off the site, which we're really proud of. And we can't do that this year. So I thought the next best thing was to do a talk about how it's looked after, because whilst it often looks really good, it does take quite a lot of thought and work to keep the site looking well. After all, it is getting on now for 1800 years old. So I called this talk Cleaning the Bath, because it's something that you need to do it regularly. You know, you can't leave it for 10 years. It will get a bit disgusting if you left the bath for 10 years. So it's something with much of conservation of historic buildings, little and often. Little and often is what's needed. And that hasn't always happened at Billingsgate. And we've learnt a valuable lesson. I showed the map of the normal street. This is a brilliant reconstruction of Roman London. And the bathhouse is over here. It's in a fairly quiet corner of Roman London. It wasn't as developed as the very heart and centre here, where you've got the Forum and Basilica and the amphitheatre, but it's right down here by the river. And this is what it looks like on the street. So when you can get back into London and when we can open again, it's in the basement of a very undistinguished office block. And so the City of London have put some valuable signage up so that if you walk past, you actually know not just where you were in Roman London, but there's something to see. And as I said, we're really missing being able to open for open house this year and for other tours, and are looking forward to the time when we can let people back in safely. Now, the site was discovered in the 1840s. As part of development in the City of London. And this is a drawing from an engraving from the Illustrated London News, the paper probably the Evening Standard really of the day, and it's a fantastic drawing. So you've got these workmen standing idly by doing nothing, and then you've got a foreman who's looking down an interesting hole to the hypercore system below, and you can see the way the modern buildings at the time in the 1840s overlay the Roman archaeology, which comes down quite substantially below ground level. It's very unusual that the site survived. Normally in the 19th century, historic remains were just swept away in the name of progress. And the City of London, I'm afraid, was well known for destruction of Roman mosaics and all sorts. But this one they decided to save, and it was preserved in the basement of new building on the site, and it survived. And more discoveries were made subsequently, and they survived. And it's actually the earliest archaeological site in the City of London that was found during development and preserved in situ. And it's a really important survival for all sorts of reasons. So it's these reasons, as well as its intrinsic Romanness, that means we like to show it off. And this is just another great picture, because as well as in the 1840s, there were other developments later. There was a development in the 1850s where we saw new discoveries being made. And then actually in the 1960s, Lower Thames Street was widened. And this is a picture from the 1960s development before the office block was on site. And this is one of the really charming team photos you get of archaeologists who are often lounging around having their tea, but this is just such a nice photo. I thought I would show it
and
to show that we've sorry,
Customs.
Kim.
Sorry, Jane, that's Customs House in the background, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the other side of the road, and
yeah.
it's a scene you never see anymore, because the Lower Thames Street is a real canyon now with these very tall buildings on either side of the road. But it's a really lovely picture, and it's got the traditional archaeological site hut or shed. So it's a great picture, and it's a site where there's been a very long legacy of archaeological involvement going from the 19th century onwards. But the site hasn't seen the light of day for really a very long time, well, since the 1960s. And being in the basement of an office block beside a very busy dual carriageway close to the water table, it's these factors that cause some of the problems that we find with the bathhouse. So the 1960s was when the site last saw daylight, and it languished in a basement for a very long time. There was work in the late 1980s. There was more excavation and conservation. But really, from that point, the City of London rather abandoned the site. And because it's very difficult to take parties of visitors into the site, it got neglected, because if people weren't seeing it and weren't checking on it and weren't complaining about it and making a fuss, what tends to happen is that budgets get used for more high profile historic properties. And the City of London has a lot of historic properties to look after. And what happened was the site, because it's low lying and close to the river, got quite damp. And also because it was close to Upper Thames Street, even though it was in a building, there were air vents that linked to the street outside. And this was the time of really very polluting petrol and lead in petrol. And lots of particulates found their way into the site, and gradually over several decades settled onto the building. And I couldn't actually find a picture of the site when it was completely black, but when I first visited in about 2008, it was completely black. It was absolutely covered in a mat of filthy black dirt and dust. So you have the moisture and the damp, you have the particulates from the road outside, you have general dust, and you have slightly crumbling mortar. And then we get these little specks of white fluff. And I don't know if you can see across here, there's this little smattering. It looks like parts of the site have been iced. And these are actually soluble salts. And there's something that we see very regularly at the bathhouse that you don't tend to see at archaeological sites, but you do in these particular circumstances. This is just another picture of the site looking a bit dark and grim in those earlier days. A little bit of conservation was done occasionally, and you can possibly see Henry the Hoover. Henry is one of building conservation's most used tools, and it's very surprising to see industrial hoovers on sites, but I'll come to their uses and why they're important shortly. So some work had been done over the years, but not very regularly. And what tends to happen is nothing happens on sites for a while, and then it gets a bit critical, and a large project is done, and then everyone thinks that's the end of it. We don't need to do anything now for another 15 years. And it doesn't really work like that. And so what I encourage on this site is little and often. But a very good tool came our way in about 2009, and that's the Heritage at Risk Register. And what Historic England does is it surveys all the designated assets, all the listed buildings, all the scheduled monuments, all the registered parks and gardens. And it checks every year whether they're vulnerable and whether they're at risk of damage or not. Because these are really important sites, and we've touched on this in these talks before. These sites are really important to all sorts of visitors. Sometimes it's just people living in a neighbourhood will get an idea of history and a feeling of stability from these sites in their neighbourhood. Sometimes people will just be really interested in Roman sites or medieval sites. But it's important to keep these sites maintained, because once they're lost, you can't recreate them again. You can't build that feeling of permanence, of history, of the exotic nature of a Roman building in the centre of commercial London. And so we publish the Heritage at Risk Register every year from Historic England, and it shows whether these sites are considered to be vulnerable to loss. And I'm afraid when we first started doing this in London for scheduled monuments, of which the Bathhouse is one, we decided that the Bathhouse was at risk. And this embarrassed the City of London, and a number of people wrote to them saying, "This is very sad, you must do something about this." And so funding was found, and so a major project was undertaken a few years after that. And since then, the City of London has done annual work in the Bathhouse to keep on top of things and to keep it in good shape. And so I'm very glad that we don't consider it to be at risk. And we do see a little bit of conservation every year, which means that when it comes to the Festival of Archaeology or Open House, the site is always looking really good. This was the site before the big project. You see, there was only a very little scaffold walkway to see the site. And another part of the issues with the site was it was very difficult to inspect it, because not only do people need to come in as visitors to see the site, people need to come in to be able to inspect the site to make sure it's in good heart. And so another thing the City of London did, as well as the major piece of conservation, was to put in a much better walkway. And that's something that, again, we've been welcoming visitors onto for the last couple of years.
I remember that scaffolding walkway when I first went down to the Bathhouse, long before I worked there, with you actually, Jane.
Yeah.
On my master's degree, and it was such a shame that it was particularly, you couldn't see the Bathhouse very well, could you, from the scaffolding?
This is the problem, because the scaffolding just came out a little way, but actually over here is the frigidarium, the tepidarium, and the caldarium, and you couldn't see it. So you couldn't see the construction of the actual bathhouse. You could see the foundations of the Roman house, but you didn't get to actually see the full glory, because, as is typical, the best view of the site is from the far corner over here. So it was fairly shocking. It lacked elegance, and occasionally it wobbled slightly as well, which is never a good thing. So I'm really glad that the current system is much improved. Right, we'll move into what Chris Packham would call the science bit. I've mentioned dirt and particulates from the road, and I've mentioned the moisture. And the whole problem that we have at the Bathhouse is one of relative humidity. And boiled down to the essentials, this is a problem with the amount of moisture there is in the air and the temperature of the air. Now, we're quite low down. If you come into the bathhouse, you have to go down a stairway to get to the Roman remains, and then you look down upon the Roman remains. The water table is quite high because we're actually quite close to the River Thames here. And we're also in a cold, dark basement. The air doesn't warm up very much. It doesn't get any benefits of the sun at all in this space. So it is quite cool and it is quite damp. And if I show a chart that I have nicked from the internet, this shows a beaker and dots, and it shows 10% relative humidity over here, so not too much moisture in the air, but 90% relative humidity over here. Now we have a lot of moisture in the air at the bathhouse, so we're looking at a more saturated environment, and this can be a problem for archaeological remains. And if I move on to the next slide I've nicked off the internet, it's not just a case of how much moisture there is in the air, it's how warm that air is. If the air is warmer, it can accommodate more moisture in the air. But if it's cooler, that can become a problem if there is a huge amount of moisture about. And we are on a site where there is a lot of moisture that's coming out of the ground. But it is cool, and so this is not a terribly good position to be in. What we need to do is gather data. Without data, we can't understand exactly what the issues are, and so how to rectify it. So one thing that we do when we're looking to conserve sites where there are problems with the environmental conditions is we tend to gather data for a year or so. When you're looking at these kinds of sites, you need to gather data for at least a year so you see the full range of seasonal fluctuations in temperature. It's no good going down for a fortnight, sticking in some data loggers and saying, well, the average over a fortnight is X, because you need to see the full seasonal range. Fortunately, these sites are quite safe, they're quite accessible, and also the Roman sites have been there for 1800 years, so the chances are nothing catastrophic is going to happen if you monitor it for a year. Obviously, you need to go down and check that the data loggers are working and check that there's been no severe change in conditions. But it is important to gather a good data set of information so you can then plan accordingly. And this is the type of data logger that we use: relative humidity, temperature. And this is actually not the bathhouse. This is another site that I look after, the charnel house in Spitalfield. It's had more complicated issues because it was inside again, but at one end of the building it had a glass panel, and so we got a lot of daylight coming in. And so as well as being dark at one end, it was very light and quite hot at the other end. So we experimented with a lot of material on that particular site. The bathhouse, we don't have to have quite as much equipment in. In fact, we have a series of these. These are, I'm not advertising for the Hanwell company, but they do make very good data loggers that are very straightforward, because what we need to know is what the relative humidity is and what the temperature is. And we need to gather that several times a day over a year just to see how things change and fluctuate over the site. This is a picture I took for a completely different purpose, so ignore the nice man from Google who was taking some really interesting photographic images of the site. This is what we're interested in. So this is our Hanwell data logger on the side of a tube which goes down through the site, and this is measuring, as well as the relative humidity in the air, we're also measuring the water depth below the ground. So we have a series of these across the site, because occasionally people will come to the site and say, what's that blue post doing there? That looks really ugly. Can't you get rid of it? And actually, it's really important that we do monitor across the site, not just in one place. And what we're discovering is that the relative humidity is quite high. It is a little bit of a problem, but actually the site is quite well ventilated. It's when it gets very cold, when there's so much moisture, the air can become saturated, but that means then that the walls can become saturated. That's when we start having a slight issue, because The icing I mentioned earlier, that starts appearing. These are soluble salts. These are mineral compounds which look like small individual crystals. And what happens is when the air is quite cool and when there's a lot of moisture in the air, and then the tiles can get slightly wet and damp, then the soluble salts start to crystallize or effloresce on the surface of the archaeological remains. And this is something that generally is just unsightly. It doesn't cause damage when the crystals just form on the surface, but it is very unsightly, and it's something that we want to deter. So one way you can do that is try and change the environmental conditions. So you can try and take some of the moisture out of the air with a dehumidifier, but it's a very, very large space. And if you go too far, what will happen is you'll dry the air so much that the mortar between the bricks will start to crumble. That will become dry and friable. And it's finding a fine balance where it's not too dry. It's the Goldilocks zone, if you like. It's not too dry, it's not too cool, it's not too damp, and it's not too hot. And we have to find the ideal conditions for the site. But because it's a big space, it's very difficult to control it artificially. So we try and do what we can, and then we work on conserving the site. And the easiest thing to do with the salt crystals is actually just to very gently brush them away. They're not doing any damage to the brick or tile, and they can be gently brushed away. But you see that they can form quite a build-up, and so need to be removed. It's very gently done with a brush, variety of brush sizes. It's best done by a conservator who's got experience of doing this, and so don't brush too vigorously. There can be a temptation when you see this covering quite large areas to roll your sleeves up and get stuck into this and brush away, but you do need to do it quite carefully because, as I've said, generally this doesn't cause any damage to the site. But if you brush too vigorously and too hard, you might do some damage to the surface of the bricks or the stones if the bricks or the stones aren't in a terribly good condition to start with. And this gives an example. This is a before and after shot of a box flue tile, which is part of the hypercore system. So this is a hollow brick, really, and air moves inside the brick, or did when the building was functional. And this is a very nice decorative one set in the wall of the bathhouse. But you see how the salts have crystallized on the surface and are really quite unsightly and stop people understanding what they're looking at. This is when the salts have been carefully brushed off afterwards. You'll see there's a slight difference in color, and that's because of the moisture still in these areas. These are slightly wetter than this area here, which is lighter. But you see, brushing the salts away has done no harm to the box flue tile. It's in very good condition underneath. So this is something that we need to do regularly now, because we've found that over the year, the site fluctuates in how cool it is and how damp it is. And so we see an efflorescence of salts, particularly in the spring, over the winter and in the spring. And these are removed every year, and they're removed before we start doing our big periods of opening for the Festival of Archaeology and for things like open house. Another thing we do to try and help with the soluble salts, this yellow layer here, this is crushed limestone, very like sand. And we use this to try and wick the salt crystals away from the Roman fabric. This is the wall of the hot room, and we lay down this crushed limestone around the Roman walls to try and draw the moisture away and to draw the salt crystals away. And that works very well. What it means is that every 5, 6 or 7 years or so, depending on how wet it's been, we have to completely replace the crushed limestone or sand. And that is a major job because it all has to be done by hand, and it has to be carried out the building up some stairs. So that is a very large job. And sadly, we were hoping to do it this year, But because of the issues with coronavirus and access onto the site, we've not been able to do it. So it may be something that we'll do later this year, or it may be something that now we do next year. But it's a very valuable way of just getting the salt crystals away from the Roman fabric. This is something that is relatively straightforward to understand if you're experienced in conserving buildings. I'm experienced in looking after a range of buildings, but not the fine detail. And I've got a range of useful colleagues who have written some extremely useful books. These are the practical building conservation books written by English Heritage and Historic England. And I'm shamelessly plugging my colleagues because they're continually experimenting and researching and looking into new methods to conserve a whole range of historic buildings. And they've put their years of expertise into a series of really valuable textbooks. And some of these are available in libraries. I have to admit they're very expensive to buy, so we all share them at work. But they're remarkably useful. So if you're involved in conserving or looking after historic building, I thoroughly recommend these to you. This is another one I use quite often. And so for the bathhouse, which is a combination of brick, mortar, and stone, these two are the really useful ones. We use professional conservators to treat these buildings. These people have years of expertise and have seen a great many buildings and how they have crumbled and failed. Generally, it's an issue of weather, it's an issue of moisture, and it's an issue of heat or cold that affects these buildings. Sometimes it's wind, sometimes it's frost. So at Billingsgate, which is inside, and again, this is a photo of the other building at Spitalfields, also inside. Generally, the problems that they suffer with tend not to be from wind or rain, but from moisture coming up from the ground and from heating and cooling. But just every so often, the mortar that these buildings are held together with will crumble. It was sacrificial, the mortar. It was never the thing that was designed to last. That was always the brick or the stone. Mortar is always designed to be replaced every so often. And it's something that we do quite regularly with historic buildings. This is just a nice photo of the bench that was used temporarily up at Spitalfields, because a wide range of materials need to be used to suit the exact circumstances. And if you look at the wall behind, you can see there's a range of different stone types. So there's some small black flint here, there's some lighter chalky material here, and up here there's some larger ragstone. Then difficult to tell, but this is Reigate stone, very, very crumbly material, and it all needs slight difference in treatments. And this is something that we find at Billingsgate. We've got a range of material types. And so the conservators will assess what's needed in each individual location, and then they'll work in one location and treat that and then move to the next. And so the site needs to be carefully protected whilst people are working in particular areas. And that's something that takes quite a lot of planning. It's not always easy to move around and access these sites. It's not like going and walking around a house or a church that's out on the street. You often have to plan quite complicated access and exits from the bathhouse to make sure you don't tread on anything or get blocked into a corner. So protection of the site is also important when you're conserving it. I'm afraid this isn't the clearest of slides. I showed the issues about salts earlier. This is actually I'll go back. This is a piece of plaster, Roman plaster, which is detaching from the wall. And this was caught in time. And what the conservators had to work out what to do here was how to stop this falling off. Because one thing that we don't like to admit to is bits falling off our ancient monuments. And this is a picture of Angus here and Sharon. They have been working on this site now for a good 10 years. In fact, when Angus was an archaeologist before he was a conservator, he actually excavated on this site in 1989. I was delighted to learn this when I was chatting to him on site. And Sharon and Angus have been working on this site, so they know it very well and they understand its treatment regimes and what's needed. And what they're doing here is they're working on that detaching plaster. And you see they've very carefully put protection down so they can kneel beside the site, because this is the Roman mosaic. They've wrapped up some of the site that they're working on and treating. And what they're actually doing, Angus is using really a great big syringe, and he's injecting, this is the detaching plaster here. So he's injecting mortar very carefully behind the detaching plaster so that he can hold the two together. And that's a very careful and slow process, but it works very well. And so once that plaster is adhered, that now should be fine for a long time, again, provided that the environmental conditions don't go to the extremes too much. Quite a lot of work is done with mortar on site, and we work in lime mortar. For many decades in the 20th century, repairs to historic buildings were done with concrete. But after a while, it became clear that concrete was much too hard and reacts badly with the softer stones and bricks that were used in the medieval and the Roman periods. And in the 1970s, something known as the lime movement, going back to using traditional materials, and that's what we do now. We try as hard as possible to use the same materials that were used at the time, and lime mortar, very traditional, was used by the Romans and was used ever since. And so this is what we do now. And this is just a picture of Angus with Sharon in the background here, and Dean Sully, who's a lecturer in conservation at University College London. And they're batching up the lime mortar to be used either by traditional pointing between the bricks and the stones, or for injecting, as I showed in that picture previously. And then our final tool at the bathhouse, I showed Henry at the very beginning, and Henry is back here. This is a far more recent picture. And actually very gently dusting the site and then hoovering away the dust is something that we do quite regularly. I showed earlier that we brush away the soluble salts, and that needs to be done carefully. But a surprising amount of dust and dirt finds its way into the site. And so Sharon, generally it is Sharon, is often to be found, and you'll see that she's using a brush and then she's holding the pipe of the hoover in her other hand. This isn't a case of using the actual hoover nozzle directly onto the dirt and the dust. It's gently brushing the dust away, which is then carefully taken away by the hoover. And it's unusual to find, or actually it's not unusual. If you're not a conservator, you might find it unusual to see a hoover on site, but it's a very effective way of getting the dust away from the site, because as you can see here, from one little piece of work on the site, an awful lot of dirt is generated annually from the Billingsgate bathhouse, and it just finds its way in from the vents from the street, even though we're in a sealed basement. So this is what we aim to show. We carefully brush away the soluble salts. We try to make sure the relative humidity is not too unstable. We point and repair the mortar and the plaster where we can, give it a final dusting and remove that dust with a hoover so that we can show a pristine site. Because what we really want to see again is we want to see queues outside the building for open house. We want to be able to give tours at open house, and we want to be able to welcome everyone back. And unfortunately, we can't do that at the moment. But what we're hoping to do is in future have as many people back into the site as possible. And in the meantime, we'll provide these sorts of films so we can give you examples of the work that we do at the bathhouse, as well as the history of the bathhouse. So that's really all I wanted to say. I just wanted to give an example of what we do on the site and show you really what goes on behind the scenes.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was so interesting, and I learned some stuff on that. Do you want to leave that? Oh, we'll come up to this page. That's fine.
Have I got out? I've got out. Right.
Yes, but just to finish off, I just wanted to say, Andrew, you've been down to the bathhouse in the last couple of weeks, which I miss
I'm
it
very
so
envious.
much. Yeah, so envious.
Well,
And how is it looking?
It feels a real privilege to go down there, and especially when you can go down there on your own and you can wander around the site and look at everything. You know, there's nothing quite like it, especially when you haven't been there for 6 months, 9 months, a year, however long it's been.
Yes.
I thought when I went round there, I was really surprised. I thought the site looked really good. The sand was smooth. There was very little, as far as I could see, salt coming up. So I was really impressed with the way that it's been maintained. I think,
I'm glad it was
wonderful.
looking good. It is very time of year and temperature dependent. So if you get a very wet winter in the early spring, so if you've only seen it recently, it's probably not looking. February tends to be the time when it's looking not so good.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, we'll have to see what happens this winter, and it has been a shame that some of the conservation work has had to be put off because of COVID, but hopefully that will be completed in the next 6 months to a year to get as you say, the sand needs replacing, and also to make sure that any salt that comes up in the spring is got rid of. So thank you so much for telling us all about this. This is one of the outputs for Open House. But Andrew, you were down there because you were filming for Open House, weren't you?
Yes, they were producing a short film on Open House. Various different locations. So they asked me to go down there. So I was chatting about the bathhouse, and it was great.
Yeah, so you'll be able to see the official Open House documentary about Billingsgate, Roman House and Baths, and this is our unofficial documentary. We were hoping that some of the conservation work would actually be going on during Open House. So this is why we decided to tell you all about what the conservation work that happens every year to keep the site looking good. So thank you very much, Jane, for coming on and telling us all about that.
Not at all. I'll look forward to seeing the other programme at Open House.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you. So we'll say bye for now.
Brilliant. Cheerio.
Bye.